In Chapter 10, we look at adolescence as a subculture, which essentially basically just looks at adolescents and the way they behave and their belief systems as being unique to them. Adolescent society refers to the organized network of relationships among adolescents. Their culture is the sum of the ways that they behave. It refers to their norms, their values, their attitudes, and practices shared by members of the adolescent society. Basically, they think, act, and live in a certain way as an adolescent. It can involve their ideas about physical attractiveness, status possessions, their social skills. There's a strong status hierarchy, their interactions at school. Basically, they separate themselves from the adult culture. And so basically, they have their own unique way of interacting with each other. Adolescent societies can be categorized into two different types, the formal and the informal. Typically, the formal has a lot to do with schools, groups, activities, sports that go along with an organized adult school type leader. There's a number of benefits to these, including self-confidence, teamwork, leadership skills. And then you have informal systems that are not necessarily led by a school or an adult. And so these are basically just groups that adolescents themselves create. Typically, you have cliques, liaisons, and crowds. Cliques being the smaller, tightly knit groups of about 3 to 10 people who spend a lot of time together. Crowds are more loosely associated. Usually it can be even up to about 100 people who are perceived as being similar. They're kind of part of the same group, but they may not necessarily be within the same clique. And then liaisons are people who kind of float from different cliques, but do not necessarily belong to one. One thing that we do see is bullying. We actually see bullying at all age groups. But bullying, defined, is unprovoked aggressive behavior that is intended to hurt another person. Kids who get bullied do tend to be the ones who are insecure, quiet, and shy. Maybe because they're seen as adolescents who are not going to take up for themselves. That makes them a target for a bully. Bullying definitely has negative effects on the victims, loss of friendships, poor academic performance, anxiety, depression. Anti-bullying programs, many programs have been put out there to try to stop or prevent bullying, and yes, they can work if done correctly. The most effective programs actually include students themselves in preventing the bullying. Essentially, if you can take the power away from the bully, then you can stop that bullying culture. Cyberbullying and traditional bullying, obviously, both of these are still occurring, but with the new technology, obviously, cyberbullying is something that we now have to take a look at. And it is different from traditional bullying in a variety of ways. Children cannot get away from cyberbullying. It's always there. It is considered anonymous, and so people will do things much more viciously anonymously than they would if someone knew who they were. And so cyberbullying can be very, very serious and very extreme. And so it is definitely a new form to what we would consider the old traditional bullying. Friendship is very important. It's an important part of development. There are a number of benefits to friendships during adolescence. It actually helps them have a sense of security because they do get emotional support from these friendships. Children who have a good friendship in adolescence do tend to do better psychologically and socially. The family's role in friendships is very important. Some families promote friendships and some families do not. Culture can also tie into this, in that some cultures do not encourage friendships because they think that it takes away from the family. Loneliness is something that can happen with adolescents if they have not connected with someone else. Affect is another word for emotions, and so loneliness is an affect that some adolescents do experience. Of course, there are very negative impacts of feeling alone, not having that connection, high levels of anxiety, being very vulnerable to criticism. All of this can be effects to loneliness. Aggression, reputational aggression, and relational aggression are two things that we'll tend to see in adolescents. Reputational aggression being that of trying to destroy someone's reputation, spreading lies and rumors about them. Relational aggression is something you see a lot in females, in which they try to not include another person and make them feel isolated and alone. Popularity is a big deal in adolescence because there is that strong hierarchy mindset in adolescence. There are two definitions of popularity. If you look at the sociometric definition, we would consider someone popular if they are friendly, sociable, helpful, cooperative, generous, and trustworthy. Although perceived popularity in adolescence is not necessarily the way we define it sociometrically. Perceived popularity is someone who's physically attractive, has a lot of money, nice clothes, mingles with other popular teens, spends time in groups, doesn't really spend time alone, and they have good leadership skills. A number of developmental changes cause adolescents to become increasingly aware of the need to belong to a group. How do teens find this social acceptance? Oftentimes it's through sports, academics, recreational activities. Those are very ideal ways to find your group. Sometimes teens will achieve popularity and acceptance through deviance, unfortunately. And physical attractiveness, material possessions, all of that will also tie into popularity and acceptance for adolescents. Dating is something that may happen in adolescence, trying to form those romantic partnerships. Dating serves several purposes: hanging out, having a good time, experimentation, building to intimacy, figuring out what it is that you are looking for in a partner, a lifelong partner. And so dating can have some positive influences on adolescent development. And then we lead into talking about living together, non-marital cohabitation. This is something that we are seeing a lot more now than we once did. It is no longer really considered taboo to live with someone in a romantic partnership before marriage. Many people see this as kind of a precursor to marriage. Some people do this because it benefits you economically. You can share in expenses. But some of the downsides to living together is that sometimes people feel like they never need to get married because if it's working as just living together, then why get married? Cohabitation versus marriage. Research has found that people who cohabitate actually have lower levels of happiness. There's more relational problems, interpersonal violence, and the relationships are less likely to endure. It would stand to reason that there is a less level of commitment because you do not have that marriage in place. Adolescent marriage, we still have some people getting married while they are still a teenager, while they're still an adolescent. Typically this happens because either a pregnancy has occurred or they actually see marriage as something that they look forward to, and so they want to go ahead and jump into that, or also probably most often they are escaping a very unhappy home life. Material concerns of the adolescent culture. The adolescent culture is very much focused on material possessions. So what do they spend their money on? Oftentimes they spend their money on clothing. This is a form of self-expression. They also spend money on automobiles. This gives them a sense of independence. And some people just like to work on automobiles, and this is something that's more of a hobby. Unfortunately, many undergraduates end up with credit card debt because of this sense of materialism. The book says that almost half of undergraduates leave college saddled with an average of at least $3,000 in credit card debt. Cell phones, computers, technology is another big thing that adolescents spend their money on. This is their main way of communicating, so all times money gets spent on the latest in technology. And then finally, we look at slang and music. These are two ways in which adolescents really separate themselves from the other, from the adult culture and the child culture. Slang is kind of their own language that they use that amongst each other that they would not necessarily use with adults. And then music choice typically is kind of unique to the adolescent population.